Melody's children while Melody was allegedly in Paris. Before even deciding whether this is true or not, what stands out most is how quickly people reacted. Instead of questioning the story, many immediately believed it or treated it as believable, which shows how the situation is viewed online. With Martell, nothing is seen as simple anymore. His past has built a reputation where even extreme rumors don't feel impossible, so when this story started spreading, it didn't feel random to people. It felt like part of an ongoing pattern. The idea of Melody being in Paris, living her life peacefully and staying away from drama, while Arionne is said to be with the children, only added more attention to the situation. People were not only reacting to the rumor itself, but also to what it seemed to represent based on everything that has happened before. In another situation, the rumor might have been dismissed quickly, but here it gained traction because of history. When someone is constantly surrounded by chaos, people stop doubting every claim and start expecting more drama instead. That is why this situation didn't feel new to many. It felt like another continuation of something already familiar. Things became even more discussed when Arionne went live and talked about her life, including her plans to return to nursing school and build stability. On the surface, it sounded like personal growth, but viewers still connected her actions back to Martell. The conversation grew again when people mentioned that Martell still drives her to school in 2025, which only added to the interpretation people were already forming. At the same time, Melody handled things differently. Instead of responding directly or getting involved in arguments, she made a short comment suggesting Martell should focus on responsibility rather than speaking online, and then remained silent. Shortly after, she posted herself driving her Range Rover, calm and focused, which many saw as her choosing peace and distance from the drama. This contrast between their approaches is what keeps the situation trending, because it is no longer just about truth or rumors. It has become about perception, behavior, and patterns. Over time, the original rumor becomes less important than how people interpret it. Audiences start judging everything based on past behavior instead of present facts. Labels begin to form about who is progressing, who is stuck, and who is responsible for the ongoing tension. Once those labels exist, every new update is filtered through them, and even small actions get turned into proof of a larger narrative. A live video becomes analysis material, a post becomes a hidden message, and a simple comment becomes something much bigger in people's minds. This cycle continues because online engagement keeps feeding it. The more people discuss it, the stronger the narrative becomes, and even silence starts to be interpreted in different ways. Nothing stays neutral anymore once it enters that level of attention. Underneath everything, the real discussion is not just about one rumor, but about repeated patterns, emotional ties that have not fully ended, and the difficulty of moving on from past situations. That is why the conversation keeps returning, even when new topics appear. As long as people believe there are connections between the individuals involved, the story will continue to evolve. Not necessarily because new events are always happening, but because old ones keep being reinterpreted in new ways. In the end, this situation shows how quickly perception can take over online. A rumor spreads, fits into existing beliefs, and becomes part of a larger narrative that feels familiar. Once that happens, it becomes harder to separate what is real from what is assumed. This raises a bigger question of whether this is truly ongoing drama or simply an internet story built from past events that people keep replaying. Because once a story reaches this point online, it no longer depends on what is actually happening in real time. It depends on how people choose to interpret it. Each new update is not viewed as an isolated moment, but as something that either confirms or challenges what people already believe. That means the same situation can be understood in completely different ways depending on who is watching and what narrative they already hold on to. Over time, this creates a kind of separation between reality and perception. The people involved continue living their lives, but online they are reduced to roles inside a story that others are constantly rewriting. Their actions are no longer seen as just personal decisions. Instead, they are turned into symbols that represent something larger: progress, control, conflict, or repetition. Once that happens, even neutral behavior can be reinterpreted in a way that fits the existing storyline. This is also why these discussions rarely reach a clear ending. There is no single moment where everything becomes agreed upon, because the foundation of the conversation is not certainty, it is interpretation. One group may see growth, another may see the same old cycle, and both sides will find moments they believe support their view. In between, there is always a wider audience that keeps the conversation active simply by engaging with it. As the cycle continues, details often get simplified. Complex relationships, timelines, and personal contexts are reduced into easy narratives that are easier to repeat and understand. This simplification helps the story spread, but it also removes a lot of the real nuance behind the situation. What remains is a version of events shaped more by repetition than by full context. Even when attention eventually moves on, the narrative doesn't fully disappear. It just becomes quieter for a while, waiting for something familiar to bring it back again. A new clip, a comment, or a rumor can easily reactivate the same discussion, not from the beginning, but from wherever it was left off. And when it returns, it usually feels even stronger because it carries all the previous interpretations with it. In the end, what keeps this cycle alive is not just what happens, but how it is understood. The audience plays a major role in shaping the story by connecting moments, assigning meaning, and reinforcing patterns. Over time, that shared interpretation becomes more influential than the actual events themselves, turning a simple situation into an ongoing narrative that keeps evolving in the public eye. And as this pattern continues, the line between discussion and assumption becomes even more blurred. People begin reacting less to what is actually said or shown, and more to what they think it must mean, based on everything that came before. That shift changes the entire tone of the conversation, because it turns every new detail into something symbolic rather than factual. At this stage, even clarification doesn't fully reset the narrative. If something is explained, it is often reinterpreted instead of accepted at face value. If something is denied, it can still be questioned. If something is confirmed, it is added into the existing storyline rather than replacing it. In that way, the narrative becomes flexible enough to include almost anything without changing its core direction. This is also where misunderstanding grows faster. Different groups start focusing on different parts of the same situation, picking the details that support their interpretation while ignoring the rest. As a result, multiple versions of the story exist at the same time, even though the original events are the same. Each version feels convincing to the people who believe in it, because it is built from selective pieces that already align with their viewpoint. Meanwhile, the emotional intensity around the situation keeps it active. People are not just observing anymore, they are invested. That investment turns casual commentary into ongoing debate, where every update feels like another chapter rather than just a separate moment. And because engagement rewards strong reactions, the most dramatic interpretations often spread the fastest. Over time, this creates a situation where the narrative starts to sustain itself. It no longer depends on constant new developments, because the audience keeps it alive through interpretation, discussion, and repetition. Even pauses in activity don't really bring closure. They just create space for anticipation of what might come next. Eventually, what remains is not just a single story, but a layered collection of opinions, memories, assumptions, and interpretations all mixed together. And once a situation reaches that point, it becomes very difficult to return it to a simple, factual conversation again. The narrative has already taken shape, and everything new will continue to pass through it before being understood. At that point, the discussion no longer functions like a normal exchange of information. It turns into a repeating loop where every new detail is immediately processed through an already established lens. Instead of asking, "What is happening?" the focus shifts to, "How does this fit what we already think is happening?" That subtle change is what keeps the cycle active even when there is no real new development. This also explains why the same situation can feel different depending on who is watching it. For some, it confirms a long-standing belief about ongoing drama and instability. For others, it looks like overanalysis and unnecessary assumptions built from incomplete information. Both sides are reacting to the same events, but they are not starting from the same foundation, which makes agreement almost impossible. As the conversation continues, emotional attachment plays a bigger role than actual details. People begin to defend interpretations instead of facts because their understanding of the situation has already become personal. At that stage, changing someone's opinion is no longer about presenting new information. It becomes about challenging the entire framework they have built around it. Meanwhile, the original context that started everything becomes harder to recognize. The more the narrative grows, the more it moves away from specific moments and into general ideas about behavior, patterns, and meaning. The situation slowly turns into a symbol rather than a sequence of events, and symbols are always more open to interpretation than facts. Even new updates lose their independence. Instead of standing on their own, they get absorbed into the existing storyline and reshaped to fit it. This is why the same type of event can happen again and again, but still feel like proof of something bigger rather than a separate incident. The narrative doesn't reset, it expands. Over time, this creates a self-sustaining structure. The audience no longer waits for clarity because clarity is no longer the goal. The focus becomes continuation, discussion, and interpretation. Every pause feels temporary, and every new development feels like a continuation of something unfinished. Eventually, what remains is not just a public conversation about a situation, but a long-running narrative built collectively by those engaging with it. It evolves not only based on what happens, but on how people choose to understand what happens. And in that space, the line between reality and interpretation becomes so thin that separating the two is no longer the main focus. The story itself becomes the focus. At this stage, the narrative has already taken on a life of its own, meaning it no longer depends on a single event or moment to stay active. Instead, it survives through repetition, interpretation, and constant engagement. Every new detail is not treated as something separate, but as another piece that must fit into an already established structure. Because of this, even ordinary updates can feel significant when they enter the conversation, simply because they are added to a story that people are already deeply invested in. What also becomes clear is how quickly context gets replaced by assumption. Instead of looking at situations with a fresh perspective each time, people often rely on memory, specifically, their memory of past patterns, behavior, and outcomes. This means that the present is constantly being judged through the lens of the past, even when the two may not fully match. As a result, understanding becomes less about what is directly shown and more about what it reminds people of. This ongoing cycle creates a strong emotional environment around the discussion. People are not just observing events, they are emotionally involved in how those events are interpreted. That involvement makes it harder to separate fact from opinion, because both begin to feel equally important in shaping the narrative. Once that happens, conversations become less about finding clarity and more about defending viewpoints. Over time, the original situation becomes less recognizable within the larger discussion surrounding it. What started as a specific set of claims or moments slowly transforms into a broader conversation about behavior, trust, repetition, and meaning. In that process, details lose their individuality and instead become part of a general storyline that keeps expanding. Even attempts to bring clarity often get absorbed into the same cycle. Instead of closing the conversation, explanations tend to be reinterpreted, questioned, or added as another layer of discussion. This is why resolution becomes difficult, not because answers are unavailable, but because the structure of the conversation is no longer built around resolution in the first place. At this point, the narrative operates more like a system than a simple story. It reacts to input, reshapes itself around new information, and continues to grow based on engagement. The audience becomes an active part of maintaining it, even unintentionally, by continuing to discuss, analyze, and revisit the same themes. And so, the cycle continues. Not because the situation itself constantly escalates, but because the interpretation of it never fully stops. Each return to the topic is not a restart, it is a continuation of everything that has already been built around it. In that sense, the narrative is no longer just about what happened or what is happening now, but about how people collectively keep the story alive through the way they understand it. And as this continues, the conversation becomes less about discovering anything new and more about reinforcing what people already believe. Each new mention of the situation is treated as another piece of evidence, even when it may not actually add anything different. Over time, this creates a loop where the same ideas are repeated in slightly different forms, keeping the discussion active but not